Cotton candy. We walked on the bridge over the Chicago River for what turned out to be the last time. And I ate cotton candy, that sugary air, that sweet blue light spun out of nothingness. It was just a moment, really, nothing more. But I remember marveling at the sturdy cables of the bridge that held us up, and threading my fingers through the long and slender fingers of my grandfather, an old man from the old world who long ago disappeared into the nether regions. And I remember that 8-year-old boy who had tasted the sweetness of air, which still clings to my mouth and disappears when I breathe. This poem is called Branch Library. I'm trying to get back to the feeling I had when I first started writing poetry. It's based on a kind of pun in English that doesn't exist in other languages. So the poem hasn't translated well because the poem is based on the odd coincidence that the word branch library is a kind of library that's a smaller library, but also part of a tree, branches of a tree. And that's what I sort of bring together, the idea of a small library, not a main library, and then the branches of a tree. Find that skinny, long-beaked boy who perched in the branches of the old branch library. He spent the Sabbath flying between the wobbly stacks and the flimsy wooden tables on the second floor, pecking at nuts, nesting in broken spines, scratching notes under his own corner patch of sky. I'd give anything to find that birdie boy again, bursting out into the dusky blue afternoon with a satchel of scrawls and scribbles, radiating heat, singing with joy. This is a poem called In Memoriam Paul Celan. And it's based on a poem of Paul Celan's that he wrote for the French poet Paul Eluard. And he wrote a poem, Celan wrote a poem called In Memoriam Paul Eluard. And so if you know that poem, this is structured exactly like it in homage to that, in homage to Celan. Most people think he's a German writer, but he's not. He's a Romanian writer who writes in German. Lay these words into the dead man's grave next to the almonds and black cherries, tiny skulls and flowering blood drops, eyes, and thou, O bitterness that pillows his head. Lay these words on the dead man's eyelids like eyebrights, like medieval trumpet flowers that will flourish this time in the shade. Let the beheaded tulips glisten with rain. Lay these words on his drowned eyelids like coins or stars, ancillary eyes. Canopy the swollen sky with sunspots while thunder addresses the ground. Syllable by syllable, clawed and handled, the words have united in grief. It is the ghostly hour of lamentation, the void's turn, mournful and absolute. Lay these words on the dead man's lips like burning tongs, a tongue of flame. A scouring eagle wheels and shrieks. Let God pray to us for this man. And maybe 2 more poems, Patty. Does that sound right?
That's great. Thank you.
Don't write elegies. I think it's funny because it's the last poem in my book, Stranger by Night, which is mainly a book of elegies. Don't write elegies anymore. Let someone else stumble past the mausoleum and grieve under the calm shade of a plane tree, wiping away the tears of his ex-wife, staining the knees of his black suit, first sobbing, then choking back sobs, comforting others, consoling himself by scrubbing the white stone and weeding the plot year after year. I'm sorry. It's too sad. It's time for someone else to mourn my dead. Though who else can do it? I just need to lie here a while longer, face down in the soil, and then get up and breathe. And then I was never able to pray. Wheel me down to the shore where the lighthouse was abandoned and the moon tolls in the rafters. Let me hear the wind paging through the trees and see the stars flaring out one by one like the forgotten faces of the dead. I was never able to pray, but let me inscribe my name in the book of waves under a dome of a sky that never ends and see my voice sail into the night.
Thanks, Ed.
My pleasure.
So let me start with a question sort of about influence. So last week we spent time with Phil Levine, which was lovely, of course. And we just touched base barely with Richard Howard at the few minutes before you came on. It's harder to find Richard's work online than it used to be. It depresses me because I love his work so much. I learned so much from him. And I was saying I have such vivid memories of him reading in Houston with immense more charm than anybody on the planet, more vivace. Do you remember that reading at Rice where he first read the fifth grade poem? And I think we were all just shocked.
Oh, they were so funny.
Unreal. So I know you've been influenced by both Levine and Richard, and of course, numerous other people. And so these are very different sort of angels on your shoulders, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how these two or others have shaped you and these sort of potentially kind of if not conflicting, certainly contrasting poets have shaped you as a writer.
Yes, these are two of my closest friends and they disapproved of each other.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Huh.
they were always complaining that I was too influenced by the other one. I think I'll start with a personal story about this because it's aside from their work, I think it's meaningful to me. When I was in my early 30s, for most of my younger life, trying to become a poet, there was just a question as what were you going to be able to be a poet at all? I mean, were you going to have a life connected to poetry? Like you could write your poems, but were you going to have a life connected to poetry? The jury was out on that. And were you going to publish a book? Jury was out. It took me a very long time. It wasn't at all clear. So I was focused on writing my poems and trying to find a life in poetry and read everything in poetry that I could. And then I published a book. I got a job at Wayne State University in Detroit. And then I published a book. And then I got tenure. And it looked like I was, going to publish another book. And it looked like I was going to have a life in poetry. And I started asking different questions, like started looking around, like what's a good model for a life in poetry? And I started looking at people older than me. And I wasn't happy with what I saw. I saw a lot of really interesting, good poets, but they all seem very unhappy to me. They seem bitter. There's so little attention paid to poetry that it's easy for people who get older to get bitter about it because poets get pushed so much to the margins of society. And you have really good poets who are not very well known outside a small circle. And I was just not thinking about their work. I was just thinking of how to live, and I didn't like what I saw. And then I met two people, older poets. I met Philip Levine first, and then I met Richard Howard second. I was living in Detroit. I was teaching at Wayne, and Phil Levine came from Detroit. And a friend of mine had sent my book to him, and he invited me over. And when he came to see his twin brother in Detroit, and um, the first thing I noticed about this guy was he was completely himself. We went to a diner. He was just wearing a shirt and an undershirt, and he took his shirt off and he was wearing his undershirt. I go, I would no more do that. And I would take 50 years before I ever took off my shirt in a diner and wore an undershirt in the diner. I go, this guy's so comfortable with himself. And I loved his poems. I love the vernacular in the poems. He's a disciple of William Carlos Williams, but there's also an element of Dylan Thomas in it. It moved from a kind of very flat language to something more romantic and elevated. But the main thing is this guy was fulfilled. Like when people invited him to do things, he did them. He taught poetry. He had a lot of friends. He had disciples. He taught at Fresno State. He's really funny about it. He made a tremendous poetry program there. I like being around this guy. And I liked the way he handled himself, which was he was just completely natural. And a lot of the older poets that I knew had fake accents, and he didn't have one. He just was himself. Then a few years later, I was now moved to Houston. I was teaching in Houston, and I was getting kind of cocky about what I read. Because when I was a younger poet, I thought, well, I didn't know any poets. I thought the way to become a poet is to read a lot. And I'll read everything because I think this club that they're going to exclude me. But if I read everything, they're not going to be able to. And then I met a lot of other young poets and realized, well, they hadn't read anything. They hadn't done any work at all. I mean, they had done workshops, but they hadn't read much in the history of poetry. And go, well, whoa, cool. I know a lot more than they do. They don't know anything. Then I met Richard Howard. Like, holy shit. This guy, not only does he know everything in the history of literature, he's like the library at Alexandria. He like learned it all in order. And he wasn't academic about it. He read it because he liked it, because he was interested in it. I thought, I want to be like that. I mean, this guy really knows everything. It just rolls off him. At first, when I met him, I thought he was faking. I couldn't believe it. So I go, oh, Richard, what was that Euripides play? And then I'd say something, he goes, oh dear. And then he just reel it out. He just tell me all about it. And I go, okay, I'm gonna write a poem about Lafcadio Hearn. And he goes, the New Orleans period or the Japanese period? I go, you can't trick this guy. I mean, this guy's really read it. And he was a complete dandy. He like modeled himself on Henry James. And so he had this sort of highly ornate, elaborate manner. And sort of my gay side, I guess I'd say, my highly aestheticized side. So Phil was my street side, and Richard was my sort of aestheticized side. And that's how I found two of my closest friends. And I was 31 when I met Phil, and I was 35 when I met Richard. And so they were in their 50s, but then they lived in their 80s. So I had 35 years of friendship with them. So I was really, really fortunate to put myself to school on their work and to learn from them as people.
I was saying before you came on that I remember Richard saying to me, dear, the great poets have read everything. And that I wanted to say to him, but Richard, there used to be less of everything, but I didn't say it. I was smart enough to not say it, even though I felt that because I was so intimidated by the
But
process.
actually, more specifically, Richard once told me that there were 3 poets in the world who literally had read everything that had come before them, not like metaphorically. One was Dante, one was Goethe, and one was Coleridge.
Mm,
Like when you actually like, if you look at their work, you don't actually see any holes.
mhm,
And what I think what he meant by that also was up until Coleridge's time, it was also possible to read everything in science as well as in the humanities. It wasn't just that they read all the poetry before, like Dante read all the science that was available in the 13th century. And so did Goethe, and so did Coleridge. But after that, it became impossible to read everything, not just the poetry. There are people who read all the poetry that came before, but you couldn't also keep up with all the work in the sciences too.
mhm,
So those were his models, those three.
mhm.
Good one.
Yeah. All right, so little sort of little redirect for today. I had my students read you and I think you're gonna laugh at this, but you and Louise Glick. And I thought it would be an interesting pairing. And it's also, since we started out with sort of covering the big poetry movements of the, 50s, 60s, 70s, I thought that, that you and Glick were interesting in your in kind of being influenced by some of those movements, maybe particularly by confessional poetry, although you may push back on that. I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, sort of kind of where do you think your poems come from in that sort of mid-century school mix? Um, and also in that, how do poets wrestle with their influences?
First of all, I love Louise's work.
Mhm,
An extraordinary poet. One of the things about her, I'd say, is that she really loved T.S. Eliot.
mhm,
And some of her poems feel like fragments that were cut out of the wasteland, like
mhm,
small versions, mythic sections that were not in the wasteland, but that she had used for her own purposes. And so there's a kind of objectivity, I would say, in her work. I mean, she's a student of Stanley Kunitz's,
mhm,
and through Kunitz, she got Theodore Rutke and that tradition, but her own love of Stevens and of Eliot in particular, because I used to disagree with her about Eliot because I thought he was such a terrible person, and an anti-Semite, and a fascist in his leanings. But Louise would go, yeah, but he's a really great poet. And she has a point. He's a really great poet. So I would say that a quality of objectivity is one aspect of her work. Also, one difference between us is that Louise, if you read her writings about poetry, she doesn't really like symmetry very much. She likes asymmetry. And so what that means is the lines are not regular and the stanzas are not regular. She likes irregularity. She likes something slightly musically offbeat, um, and interrupted. And she's not attracted the way I am to symmetrical forms or to symmetrical shapes. So whereas when I write in stanzas, I've sometimes used irregular stanzas, but I mostly use regular sized rooms. I
mhm,
set a pattern and follow the pattern, but Louise doesn't like that. She breaks it up. And she
mhm,
breaks it up in the poets that she likes to read too. She likes things like the objectivist poets that are a little more irregular.
mhm,
Um, so con confessional poetry, so-called, is one of those odd names because no one who was called a confessional poet liked to be called a confessional poet. No one liked the name at all, except M.L. Rosenthal, who coined it, and the critics who used it to identify something. And so there's no using the label by poets without poets complaining about the label. And the reason that they complain about the label is because confessionalism suggests that people are only writing about their worst traumas, and that all confessional poetry is about alcoholism, suicide, despair, etc. And it's not that those subjects, there was a breakthrough in subject matter by Robert Lowell and John Berriman and Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton and those who come afterwards. But the idea of the confession, if you take the confession and you turn it back to St. Augustine, then you're on to something about bringing into a self-interrogation into poetry that hadn't always been there before. But if you think of confessionalism as just writing about terrible things that happened to you, no one likes the label, because there are a lot of people that are suicidal that don't write poetry, and there are a lot of alcoholics that don't write poetry, and a lot of other terrible things happen to people. It suggests, it leaves out the skill that's involved in writing a poem and the transformative power of poetry to turn personal experience into dramatic form. Now, that being said, I do think that the poets of the late 50s, early 60s, and then into the 70s were in radical reaction to modernism and to the heroic nature of modernism, because the modernist poets made it seem as if everything had been done and that the poetry was already over for these poets. But modernist poetry was intentionally objective. Like Ezra Pound wanted something cold, like a sculpture. And Eliot, whose poems are incredibly confessional, always suggested that poetry was not at all personal, it was just objective, and he came up with these horrible formulations like the objective correlative to disguise the fact that his poems were so personal. So you take an incredibly personal poem like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, and you put a title on it that gives it another name, and suddenly everyone thinks it's a dramatic monologue. Whereas, and it is, except it's a dramatic monologue which is completely filled with Eliot's own experience. And so Eliot just was able to have this sleight of hand that distracted everyone from his personal grouses. And I guess in the 60s, poets stopped using that kind of screen. But if you read, say, the new biography of Sylvia Plath, one of the things you discover is that when Sylvia Plath wrote her poem Daddy, she and her best friend were in stitches on the floor. They thought it was hysterically funny. Now, when it was taught to me when I read Ariel, when that first came out, no one thought it was funny. Everyone thought it was just tormented. And that the poem Daddy was just a tremendous indictment of her father first, and then her husband, Ted Hughes, second. It is that, but it's also comical. And so we just missed the tone of how Daddy was like light verse. And she had picked a lot of this up. She and Ted Hughes had picked a lot of this up from Theodore Roethke and from his long sequences. So I guess I would say that they brought an avowedly personal element into poetry that had been disguised or hidden before. Pound, called his selected poems personae. He wanted masks for the self. They're in camouflage. I personally think that their work of these modernists is a little more like a drag show. And what I mean by that is that you actually can see the face beneath the screen. It's not entirely convincing as the way, say, Robert Browning is. Robert Browning is really convincing as a dramatic monologue, as speaking as someone else. But I would say the modernists are not as convincing as that, because the persona is like J. Alfred Prufrock is not a person. It's not a character as in literature. Hugh Kenner says it's a name plus a voice.
Hmm.
And I think that's really different than the dramatic monologues of Browning in the 19th century, where those are really more like um, uh, offshoots of a scene in Shakespeare with two characters.
Mhm. So earlier this semester, we read Charles Webb's essay, The Limits of Indeterminacy, in which Charles argues in favor of what he calls less difficult poetry. And we also read Reginald Shepard's essay Against Identity Poetics, in which he articulates what he feels are the limitations of identity poetics. So I'm wondering what you think about these limitations. That indeterminacy or difficulty has its limits, and that identity has its limits.
Um, Both true, but I guess I would say that I think this actually depends on the temperament of the poet. And so um, obscurity for its own sake is is unnecessary and makes a lot of poetry that doesn't mean very much seem like it has got some secrets. But if you take like one of my models, Paul Celan, you go, well, Paul Celan turned to something more occult because he was in a kind of conflict with his own language. Like Paul Celan was in a war with the German language, which he thought because of what had historically happened, he hated the language that enabled him to be a poet entirely. So he starts to interfere with his own writing, his own project, and I think you get those later poems of Paul Celan. I don't think we need those poems to be clearer.
Mhm.
Um, and so I'd say that this depends on the authority and authenticity of the poet. I completely agree with Charles that you read a lot of esoteric poems and you go, these just don't mean anything. And then you spend a lot of time looking at them and then you look and you go, well, I don't see that this pays off. And it just turns people away from poetry. And Charles's project is a very American project. And he wants to change the level, sort of the way Marianne Moore said that she writes her poems in plain American that even cats and dogs can read. And so I'd say I love the poems in plain American that even cats and dogs can read, but I don't think we need all poets to write that way. Um, so on that, I'd say you should be as confessional as you're temperamentally enabled. So I love Marianne Moore, but she's not very confessional at all. For warmth of feeling, I prefer Elizabeth Bishop, who lets more personal life into her poems. But I think this is temperamental, and they're both really great poets.
Mhm.
Same thing, what I'd say about identity is that identity has been important in poetry when it has enabled people to tell stories that were left out of the canon. So that Evan Boland has made an incredibly strong case about this in terms of women's poetry historically, that if your subjects are all epic poems, then that means that war and nationhood is the subject of poetry. That leaves out female experience. Because historically women weren't allowed to go to war. And so it leaves out the whole domestic realm. And so by creating a subject matter for poetry, you can also leave out large realms of experience.
Mhm.
And Evan made the case that this is completely wrong and made the case for all kinds of poets like Charlotte Mew, the 19th century English poet that I like so much, who lived into the 20th century, um, or Stevie Smith, or all kinds of women poets who did all kinds of different things. And so I think she's right about that. So bringing in different kinds of subject matter and different kinds of people's experience is important. And so if you have all white men writing poetry, then you're going to get a white man's male perspective. And it's really important that we get other kinds of stories in our poetry from all different kinds of places. For example, I love Paul Celan, but I also love Rose Auslander. And Rose Auslander's experience she's from the same part of the world, from Bukovina, the way Celan is, but her poetry is much more intimate, much more personal. I love a poem of hers about her mother called My Nightingale, which I included in 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, where it's a conversation where she says to her mother, if you could be any animal or in the world, what would you be? And her mother says a nightingale. And then after her mother dies, Rose Auslander says, now I hear the nightingale singing. She sings of her native Bukovina. She sings of the woods and forests of Bukovina. I mean, it's just an incredibly beautiful poem. He goes, my nightingale sings to me night after night in the garden of my sleepless dream. It's so beautiful. It's outside the range of what Celan could do. It just does something else. But I think if you then come to Reginald Shepard's essay, he's making the case that this is especially an American phenomena, I think, that identity brings different stories into the realm. But then if all you value are different stories, and all you value in poetry is the identity of the writer of the poem, then that also becomes a kind of straitjacket. And Reginald was a formalist and extremely skillful crafts person. And so he wants poetry to be known not just for the identity of the writer, but also the skill of the poet and what they're writing about. And so he's arguing for a larger range of experience. And so I guess what I would say is that every breakthrough in poetry historically eventually becomes a limitation. So the Petrarchan sonnet is an incredible invention that Petrarch takes and creates a tremendous machinery around erotic love for this poem. But then when a whole continent of poets only write Petrarchan sonnets, the Petrarchan sonnet becomes a kind of straitjacket. And in response to this, for example, that then this becomes the English sonnet, which changes form, but is still a sonnet. The subject is completely around love until Milton comes along and makes the sonnet into a political machine. He uses sonnets, but he writes about politics, or he writes about his own blindness. And suddenly the sonnet has all kinds of other uses. So, but if you say that all poets have to write Petrarchan sonnets, you've clearly got a problem in terms of what poetry can do. And so I'd say that American poetry has an invisible problem. It's not a formal problem, but it's a subject matter problem, and we still have it, which is most poetry. I mean, this seems insane to say, but it's the case that most poetry programs, the people don't care very much about poetry. That what they really care about is the identity of the speakers and telling the stories. And I don't want to be mistaken here. It's really important that those stories get told. But that shouldn't be the only qualification for making poems that matter. Does that make sense, Patty?
It does, and you're reminding me of working with Adam Zagajewski at Houston, when he would sometimes say to us notoriously, he would read a poem and he'd say, is this a poem? And I wrote about that in my memorial piece for Adam, and I said, so often when he said that, I thought, probably not, but I'll work on it, and which was inspiring, I mean, probably, but I think that sort of pivots to my next question, which is that, you know, differences between, you sort of articulated what you see as sort of an issue or a challenge or a problem in current American poetry. Can you contrast that with what's happening simultaneously or what has happened in the late 20th century in Eastern European poetry?
Yes. One of the reasons that I myself turned to poetry of different countries from Eastern Europe, especially Polish poetry, which, by the way, Norman Mania disapproves of my love of Polish poetry. Um,
Thinks you
um,
should just be reading Eminescu, pretty much. That's it. Just.
it's there are others. Yeah, there are others, but yeah, I mean, we can include Tristan Zara, for example, and others. But yes, that's sort of the argument. Um, but there's also like Nazım Hikmet in Turkey and Atilla Yosef and Miklos Radnadi in Hungary. And there are the great Russian poets in the 1920s, Mandelstam and Akhmatova and Svetaeva. Um, I turned to all kinds of things when I was in my 20s. And I think that for me personally, I'll come to the larger questions here, but for me personally, I was looking for something else that I didn't find in Anglo-American modernism, which is I found Anglo-American modernism extremely cold emotionally. And I was looking for something that was not so cold. Something that was, are you still there, Patty?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I've lost you from my screen.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
when someone goes off, it changes the screen.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yeah, I'm here.
Anyway, I was looking for a model of seriousness, um, of poetry with a warmer temperature. And that's how I found various poets like Miłosz and Herbert and Zimborska, then Zagajewski, or these other poets from other countries. And I was interested in the way that they wrote about their own personal experience and also societal experiences, and especially in relationship to the community. I would distinguish Latin American poetry from Eastern European poetry because I was also discovering the great Latin American poets like the Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo and Pablo Neruda, who you know, and the Spanish language poets, the Spanish surrealists like Garcia Lorca and Rafael Alberti and Miguel Hernandez, great poets. And I would say the difference is that these poets were from Latin America, especially, were just oppositional. They're great poets, but they're politically explicit and they don't have any conflict about their opposition to the government. Whereas I'd say that Zagajewski articulates this in his prose book, Solidarity, Solitude. And on the one hand, he started out as a solidarity poet, which is a complete opposition to the Soviet government. And the solidarity movement is the communal movement against an oppressive regime. But then he began to feel that although this was true, politically, it was limiting poetry. And there was some other part of himself that was not interested in politics, but was interested in, say, classical music or metaphysical philosophy or the nature of God. And in Polish poetry, you begin to have this dialogue that takes place between the communal and the individual, between what I would call the historical and the metaphysical. And that is, you can't ignore the fact that these poets could not ignore the fact that their country was taken over by two totalitarian regimes, first the Germans and then the Soviets. You're a small country. You can't ignore that this is happening to your country. At the same time, if you spend all your time in opposition to that government, you're ignoring this other metaphysical side. And so in my chapter on how to read a poem on Polish poetry, I try to take up what I think distinguishes Polish poetry and Eastern European poetry from the politics of other oppositional poetry, say the protest poetry of South Africa, which is a great protest poetry, but really something quite different. And I think that in Eastern European poetry, unlike other poetries around the world, you have this kind of ongoing dialogue between solidarity and solitude that I myself have found very stimulating.
So, I had and I'll try to reduce this to two questions and two more, by the way. Thank you for letting us keep you for this long. It's really a
Are we
pleasure.
losing students?
No, everybody's here. They're
Okay.
all here. I don't want to overstay my welcome. But so we were talking about Adam Zagievsky, and he had written about a conflict he had with poet Svetaia Todorov concerning specificity in poems and the need, and I know I'm reducing this argument, the need for transcendence as well as specificity. And when I mentioned this to you, you said this this rent their friendship, basically, that this divided them ultimately. And I think it's interesting just because of this sort of desire for the concrete detail and for the celebration of daily life. But Adam's saying, Mike, I think that's not enough. That's not enough. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I think you have a little more inside intel on that.
Well, yes. I mean, yes, Adam, as you know, is one of my closest friends. And through him, I'm in Paris, I met Todorov, who is not a poet, but an extraordinary critic. And Todorov is Bulgarian. He was a protege of Roland Barthes and one of the great structuralists. And then he turned away from structuralism into something more humane and became a much more humanitarian critic, very honorably, by the way, and wrote a tremendous book about literature and the Holocaust. And earlier, he had written like structural analysis of fantasy and different things like that. He was a structuralist, and then he became a post-structuralist, and then he became a humanist. So Svetan wrote, and there were the sort of trio in Paris of C.K. Williams and Adam and Svetan. They were all really very close friends. And Svetan did a really beautiful book about Dutch art. It had the art of the Dutch Golden Age, which, as you know, is just a spectacular moment, democratic moment in 17th century Dutch art, where for the first time, all these genre painters had painted daily life, ordinary middle-class life, women reading, and then the painters, women reading letters and people drinking coffee and various things. And the Dutch artists divided up into many different kind of guilds. So there were people who just painted maritime scenes, and there were people who did domestic scenes, and there were people who did churches, but it was a secular art, wide-ranging, gilded, incredibly craftsmanship. And Adam, it's a beautiful book, by the way, In Praise of Ordinary Life. And Adam wrote a review of this in the New Republic. By the way, Adam and I he did the same thing to me many times, but it never changed our friendship, which is we'd be on a panel and he'd go, My dear friend Eddie believes that Joseph Brodsky is not a political poet. But I have here a poem of his that he wrote about Ukraine, and then he just would try to demolish my argument. I always thought it was funny. Um, and we had a lot of things like that. No problem for me. But Adam wrote a piece in the New Republic about Svetan's book about Dutch art, and he did the same thing. He goes, unlike my dear friend Svetan, I do not believe that ordinary life is sufficient. The painting of ordinary life is sufficient for painting. And the example that he uses, I think an irrefutable example, is Vermeer. So that, yes, you have these great genre painters of daily life, and then you have as one of them Vermeer. But something about the light that Vermeer shines on these ordinary scenes give them a kind of radiance. A street corner becomes something else. A woman with a pearl earring becomes something else in Vermeer. And Adam calls that other radiance transcendence. And that was the Svetan took the disagreement in public really hard. And what could have been just a friendly argument ended up with the breaking of their friendship. If you take it outside the personal, it's a really interesting argument. And I would say that neither one is exactly right. It depends on your temperament. So what I mean by that is there are poets who are poets of immanence. They're just poets of the world is as it is. Like William Carlos Williams is an example of that. The poem, A Red Wheelbarrow is a Red Wheelbarrow. It's not because of what it symbolizes. And he is a non-religious poet. He's a secular poet who believes in not symbolism, but immanence, and that the world has meaning unto itself. And that capturing the things of this world for that is what poetry is supposed to do. Then there are other poets like Miłosz, who is secretly a Catholic poet, or Zagajewski, who is a Catholic poet without a creed, who use ordinary life to get to something else, something more sacred. And one of the miracles of Zagajewski's poems is the way they move from the quotidian to some other higher realm in a very short amount of space. I mean, he gets tremendous velocity and liftoff through metaphor, in a very short amount of time. I mean, he used to say that in his readings, he was like a Soviet plane. It was a little hard getting off the ground and then it flies. And I'd say that's how Adam's poems are. They begin in one realm, and in a very short amount of time, they move to another realm, which you'd call transcendental or metaphysical or something else. Mysticism for beginners is a good example of that. But really, many of them work like that. He somehow manages to go from one plane to hit, I call it levers of transcendence. He hits a lever, he starts accelerating the metaphors, and then he moves to another plane. And he's a great poet. But not all poems work that way, and not all poets do that. Like that doesn't happen in Wisława Szymborska, for example, nor is it meant to. She's a kind of skeptic, a philosophical skeptic who presses a subject intellectually until it breaks down. She takes a kind of experiment and follows it through to its logical conclusion. That's just a different way of thinking about poetry. So, I mean, whatever leads you to write poems is whatever leads you to write poems. And if the poems are great, I don't think it matters. But I think all of these arguments about identity, about clarity in poetry, about transcendence, are arguments about when a prevailing mode feels like a limitation. And the poet is trying to break through whatever that larger cultural limitation is to make space for themselves and to make space for the kind of poetry that they want to write. And so they come up with a program. And I think that program is very useful to make the space for other poets and for themselves. But is it inherently true? I think you can write great poems using Svetan's model, and you can write great poems using Zagajewski's model. And there are great Dutch painters who really are just the world as it is. And then there are other Dutch painters that give you some other radiance that gives you a kind of glow that feels otherworldly. And so that's what I would say about their disagreement. You wouldn't want to I don't like prescriptions in poetry because you don't want to try and turn Wallace Stevens into Ezra Pound. He didn't like Ezra Pound. He didn't want to write like him. And you don't want to turn Hart Crane into William Carlos Williams. He had a different kind of romantic vision of poetry that goes back to the English Romantics. And I think that the trouble with a canon is that the canon starts to eliminate people based on the prescriptions. So I think the important thing is to read for yourself. So, for example, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot didn't like Amy Lowell as a barker for the new poetry. They thought she was crude. And Ezra Pound called it Amyism. And if you looked at the followers of modernism, they took Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot at their word, and Amy Lowell's kind of written out of the canon. But if you go back and read Amy Lowell's poems, I think you find something that is unexpected, which is poems of same-sex love that are extremely delicate, and that we don't really have another gay poet like Amy Lowell in early modernism. But she'd been written out of the canon because of her sort of crude arguments about modernism. So, and free verse. So canons are necessary in terms of forming things, but they also leave people out. Again, the free verse revolution of Pound and Eliot left out an incredible group of female lyricists from the 1920s in American poetry. Edna St. Vincent Millay, Eleanor Wiley, Sarah Teasdale, Leonie Adams, Louise Bogan. They're really good formal poets, but they were writing in traditional forms and therefore went against the prescriptions of modernism, which is, as Ezra Pound said, break the back of the pentameter. And I'm all for breaking the back of the pentameter if it's your own back. But not so enthusiastic about it if it leaves out a whole group of other poets who are missing, whose experience is being discounted because they're writing love poems using 19th century forms.
So I had a final question, which is, in a previous interview, you'd said you'd like to have dinner with Keats or take a walk with Frank O'Hara. So I'd like you to give you the chance to sort of expand on your social club that will definitely have you for a member. I don't think there should be a concern anymore. And ask, so we've got dinner, we've got a walk. Who's lunch with? Who are the drinks with? What other poets will you feel like it would have been sort of great to know?
I think it was Pasternak who said that he loved Tolstoy, but he didn't necessarily want to have dinner with him. And so all of these figures are projections of what, because if we don't know them, we don't know them. I mean, I think Coleridge was a tremendous talker. Would it be fun to have dinner with Coleridge? Yes, unless he completely monopolized the conversation, and then no one else got a word in edgewise, then it wouldn't be that much fun. But could he teach you shit? Unbelievable. Um, the reason I pick Keats is I believe that he's the most lovable person in English literature.
Hmm.
Um, in terms of, but I'm basing this on his letters, his poems, and 4 biographies of him. I mean, Keats is unusual because usually there's a good biography and a bad biography and a mediocre biography, but in Keats's case, all 4 biographies are good.
Yeah.
Like, how is that? It's because Keats is so, there's something so pure about Keats, and he comes through as such an extraordinary person in his letters that you think, and then Keats said, I want to be amongst the English poets after my death. You go, well, I'd like to be with Keats too. He, it would have been odd to be with him because he spoke in a strong Cockney accent. Um, Keats, when he was in school, was a prize fighter. People don't think they think of him as this sentimental figure, but he actually was a scrapper. Um, but it's the originality of his mind. It's the letters, which are written as letters to friends, because he didn't write literary criticism. The ideas just come spilling out of him, like the idea of negative capability, which is in a letter, thinking about Shakespeare and how Shakespeare was not in any one of his characters, but is in all of the characters. And that Shakespeare puts as much love into Iago as he does into Imogen, and that this is the nature of the playwright, and that poetry then should be not have a personality. The poet should be able to infuse himself into all things. It's a kind of form of pantheism. Anyway, it's because of these letters, which are so charmed, um, and um, and they're the originality of the mind and the good-heartedness of the person. Um, and then the reason I said Frank O'Hara is because his poems are so much fun to read, and they're so jaunty, and they're basically, they're walking around the city, and they're like, let's stop, let's go to the bookstore and like pick this out, and then let's walk up Sixth Avenue and get a burger. And they have this kind of friendliness to them, familiarity, and they get down off the high horse, get off their stilts, and walk around. So I go, and then all the accounts of Frank O'Hara are just what a charming person he was. And everyone who wrote about him from the New York poets, because he died. Maybe it's because both of these poets died young. People just only spoke about them with affection. And so the portrait that you get of Frank O'Hara is just, this guy be really fun to walk around with.
Mhm.
So whereas, I revere Paul Celan, but when you read the accounts of going to meet Paul Celan, he was so paranoid and so nervous that it mostly didn't go well. Although there's a wonderful account of Zbigniew Herbert, who spent a night walking around with Paul Celan, and Herbert said they didn't say anything, and it was one of the greatest conversations he ever had. So I always thought that was funny. So I'm basing this based I'm very well aware that there's a persona that comes through in different poets, not exactly the way they are, but the persona, it brings you through. So Philip Larkin has a horrible reputation now based on his letters, which are filled with racist slurs and misogynistic statements to his friends who incite him. And then you read all the accounts of people who were with Philip Larkin, and he sounds like he was really fun. Like he had a very droll wit. He didn't say anything out of order except the kind of wicked, sort of mean girl kind of thing that he did. Um, but he was really funny and quite clever and quite politic. He didn't just, but then in his letters, mainly to Kingsley Amis and Robert Conquest. He just let it loose, mainly to entertain them, and you just get a feeling of a sort of really horrible person. Um, so the letters tell you one thing, the poems and the accounts of being with him tell you something else. So, um, not so much fun to be with Robert Lowell, tremendous fun to be with Randall Jarrell.
Mhm.
That's sort of how you get it. I mean, Bishop, everyone says, was really great to be around as long as you didn't try and talk about poetry too much.
Mhm. I think Richard, I think, knew her somewhat, if I recall right. Richard Howard,
He met her, but really it was James Merrill who was much closer to her. And Frank Bedart was a protege. But you know, her letters just give you a tremendous feeling of what she was like as a person. And they're filled with funny stories too. Like when she won the Pulitzer Prize, she was living in Brazil. She didn't have anyone to tell. So she went to the local bakery. She said, "Hey, I just won the Pulitzer Prize in poetry." And the baker said, "That's incredible. All my customers win prizes. Last week, someone won a bicycle."
It's great. Isn't that a little similar to, or something when Jim Borshka, when they came to tell her that she'd won the Nobel and she was supposedly sort of annoyed that they had bothered her a little bit or something.
Yeah, I went to interview her. The New York Times sent me to Poland um, to interview her for the New York Times when she won the Nobel Prize, and the Times wanted me to just go, and I refused. I thought I can't. She's a shy person. I can't just show up. They go, "We're the New York Times." I said, "No." So um, I called Miłosz, and Miłosz and his wife Carol were on the phone, and I said the New York Times wanted to send me, but I didn't know whether I should go or not. And there was dead silence. And then Carol said, "Cheswa, Cheswa." And he says, "Okay, I'll introduce you." And then he called me back and told me what he said to her, which is, "I know you don't really want to see him, but you must sacrifice yourself on the altar of Polish poetry."
Wow, great, great.
So she did. But I mean, you know, Adam used to go to dinner parties with her and other people, Richard Kronitsky, and I think she was just a completely charming person. She wasn't so shy in person, but she didn't like literary life. She liked the people she liked, and she liked parties, and but she didn't want to talk about, she wasn't like Miwo. She didn't want to be a spokesperson for poetry. She'd been burned when she was young, um, and didn't just did not want to speak aloud about it. But sometimes she had to sacrifice herself on the altar.
Well, Ed, thank you so much. It's so nice to hear you and nice to see you. And I'm so happy for my students. And I'm just thank you. It's really been a pleasure. I feel
Love
like
to be with everyone. I wish we were there in person. It'll be so much more fun.
I know, I
Yep.
know.
I had a wonderful time when I was in Yash, so I envy you. I envy you that.
Wait, hold on. Donna's talking to me. Hold on. Yash was great. I think Yash is the hidden. I mean, I think a lot of Americans don't know so much about Yash. I think it's a wonderful city. You know, I really feel lucky to be here. So, oh, Donna is asking me to talk to you about a possible about a keynote speech in the spring. So,
May,
it would be in May.
any,
Do what?
15th or 17th of May.
I think that
Those are
she's
the
gonna,
conferences.
I think it's the mid-May, and I think she and I will reach out to you about this at a later date. But now that it's recorded, I really have to do that.
Donna's trying to get me to say yes on a recorded line. I I see what's going on here. She's trying to get me to say yes while it's recorded before I know what it is. Good one. Good
It's-
one.
It's very artful, I have to say. It's terrific.
Tell Donna that when she asks, she should hold this up.
That's right. Ed, thank you again. So nice to see you.
Such a pleasure to talk to you all about poetry, my great joy. So, greetings to the ocean.
Greetings. Take care. Be well.
Bye.
Thank you. This was a special night. Bye.
Bye.
But really, Patty, how do I end this? I simply end it